is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The U.S. and its Western allies have maintained wide-ranging sanctions on Russia since Moscow began its special military operation in Ukraine. However, in an interlinked world, the ripple effects of these sanctions may have spread far and wide beyond the Russian borders. So this week on the program, we ask, could the rocketing cost of living in Africa be an unintended consequence of U.S.-led sanctions on Russia? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, to discuss this issue, I'm now joined by our panel of experts. From Pretoria, Kofi M. Kwaku, Africa Affairs Analyst. In Abuja, Professor Ken Ife, Global Economist and Chief Economic Strategist at ECOWAS Commission. And joining us from Birmingham, Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of U.S. and International Politics, Clinton Institute, University College, Dublin. A warm welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us on the program. Well, Kofi, let me start off with you because 1 year since the Russian-Ukraine conflict, African countries have not been spared the aftershocks of the conflict as well as the impact of Western-imposed sanctions on Russia. What have been the unintended consequences for Africa as a result of the sanctions on Russia?
I find myself having a contrarian view. I don't even think these are unintended consequences because any anticipatory governance leader would probably get a sense of foresight and understand the nature of sanctions, their impact and their consequences on the global economy, but most important on Africa and on African countries. So one of them, of course, has been economic painful in terms of inflation, but also the provision for food and the cost of food being so high on the international market. And we know for sure, the evidence is there that as soon as there is a little bit of crisis anywhere in the world, people who are selling and marketplaces and producers tend to hike the prices. So Africa should have been aware of that. That's one of the reasons I believe it's not an intended consequences, but they should have been prepared for it.
So you're saying, Kofi, that the consequences were foreseen, particularly for the continent?
Indeed. I mean, the history and the evidence of sanctions are there. So any anticipatory governance leader should have at least, anticipate some of them and know that they will happen and prepare somehow in some way. But it is some kind of, for Africa, we all are pain to understand that we always a collateral damage for anything that happens around the world. And the question is, how long are we going to be collateral damage for these kind of global sanctions? And Africans must answer them. I think as long as we don't have the preparedness, the anticipatory strength to really build our economy so much so that we can cushion these sanctions, we are still going to be collateral damage and we're still going to suffer the consequences of those sanctions.
So, Kofi, we're going to look at that issue of Africa being so unprepared in a moment. But first, Professor Lucas, take us back and briefly outline those sanctions for us. Could you provide an overview of the nature and the scope of these U.S.-led sanctions on Russia, including the specific measures imposed and their intended objectives here?
The sanctions are not the cause of the damage. They're a response to, they're an effect of that Russian invasion. Now, having said that, these sanctions that were put in place, not just by the U.S., by the international community, by many countries in the international community, were to try to constrict the Russian ability to wage war. So, for example, you tried to restrict Russia's ability to import any technology that could assist their military operations or that could assist industries that were vital to the invasion. You tried to restrict Russia's exports, especially exports of energy products, to try to reduce the revenues that the state would then use to continue the war. You tried to disconnect the Russian financial and banking system from the international system to try to isolate it, at least in large part, from the global community. Those sanctions were effectively put on Russia to say, look, withdraw your forces, stop the invasion, and the sanctions are lifted. But unfortunately, Vladimir Putin has caused further economic damage, not just by waging war on Ukraine, but affecting Africa by attacking Ukraine's infrastructure, which restricts its ability to, of course, export food and grain, and especially by blockading the Ukrainian ports, which are vital to the global economy.
All right. So, Professor Ife, let's look at that in depth for a minute, because we saw one of the first and most pronounced effects of the conflict being the surge in global commodity prices, particularly for oil and wheat. And this is where Africa was badly hit. What specific sectors or industries in Africa do you think have been the most affected by the sanctions on Russia?
All industries. Let me explain to you. After the balkanization of Africa in 1884, the next bus stop was what I call International Division of Labor, which consigned Africa to commodity producers. And then what you do, whatever you produce goes to the West, raw materials, they now use the employment to, to process this and bring it back to you to consume. Now that pattern means that you are condemned to perpetual instability. You could never grow the economy, and whatever happens, you are now going to be import dependent by design. Now, when you are import dependent, then it means that you are vulnerable and you're on the transmission belt of any conceivable global shock, economic shock. Be it mortgage, prime mortgage from America, be it COVID-19, be it anything that is global will hit you, even when you are producing these raw materials. And let me just give you one example. Nigeria, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire produce 72% of world cocoa,
right,
but we only account for 7% of the entire value chain of cocoa. That's the structure. And then you see the likes of a European Economic Program wanting to perpetuate that structure by saying to you, we want 80% of your market.
Right.
That means they continue to use the labor to produce, and then you continue to consume. So when you complain, they give you loan. If you complain, they give you a grant. So we have to fundamentally look at that. Otherwise, it's already there. It's got to happen. It doesn't matter whether it's from Russia or from Ukraine, it will happen. Europe was relying on Russia for 40% of their gas. So their prices gone up. You import those imported inflation from them. So that is what happens. So we need to fundamentally address value addition. When you address value addition, you're able to cater for yourself. Then
right,
the surplus you can export to others to meet global market.
So, Kofi, looking at where Africa is at the moment, I mean, the impact of those sanctions, would you say these sanctions have generally then achieved the intended objectives?
In fact, they haven't. I mean, if you look at the sanctions from the U.S., apparently there are about more than 11,000 sanctions against Russia. And the evidence is showing, the World Bank has already published a report, I think it was last year, that the Russian economy seems to be doing well. It's even growing. Not only that, but the disturbance that the sanctions should have caused haven't really helped. In fact, they've created a new, very complicated global movement of de-dollarization, because many countries feel that the use of the US dollar against Russia and the sanction that they applied might apply to them. So many of them are scrambling to figure out, how do we use another currency and then trade among ourselves without using the dollar? Now, for Africa, Africa is still stuck in that middle. And I still say, one of the things that's really painful for many of us observers who are looking at this and our leaders is the fact that there seems to be no agency on the part of our leaders to really deal with the structural dependency. And we continuously tell the old century story of lack of agency. This is where we are, this is what we're doing. And it reminds me about a very powerful Chinese story called The Beggar with the Golden Bowl. And it can be interpreted a different way, but it's just the beggar, in this case, I take Africa, with the golden bowl. We seem to have everything here, but we continuously go into beg for things
right,
outside. And we are under this sort of pressure and an influence, hegemonic, pressure that makes that almost so that we have the sense that we don't have any agency over our own, and we still crying out, begging other people for help. So my position is we must do something about what we already know. That structural dependency must be broken.
Professor Lucas, I'll put this to you as well. Would you say that the sanctions have achieved intended objectives?
I'm afraid that, in fact, it's not true that the Russian economy has been growing quite well. The Russian economy has actually contracted last year. Russian official figures will try to claim that the GDP has improved by about 3 to 4%, but those figures are not reliable. Russia's oil and gas revenues, which has been perhaps its most important sector, have decreased by 40%. They're now reliant on a far smaller pool of customers, especially China. And China, of course, can at some point, as it were, put pressure on Russia. In effect, it's got it almost in a hostage position if we were to talk about structural dependency. So in the broader issue, however, and I've got to say I agree with, with both my esteemed colleagues here that I'm an old guy, but ever since I was a boy, the issue of structural dependency has been a very key one for Africa, and it's one that we need to deal with. Unfortunately, the shocks to supply chains, including because of COVID-19, and now because of the Russian invasion, have further exposed the fact that we need to deal with the structural dependency. I think my big message here, however, is trying to blame Western sanctions on Russia for causing all of this. That's a diversion. That's a diversion, and it doesn't help us deal with the problem. And at the end of the day, look, we don't need to sacrifice Ukrainians to try to responsibly address what Africans need from the global community during and beyond the Russian invasion.
Professor Ife, your view here, who's to blame for this state of affairs?
No, I think we have to blame ourselves because we have opportunity to address these issues time and time again. Now, Africa Continental Free Trade gives us just a window of opportunity to deal with the twin problem of currency, forex, because 60% of world debt is denominated in dollars. And then, you have all these challenges around single currency and all of that. And I see that the AFCTA, the Pan-African Payment System, allows us to now put dollar by the side and trade within ourselves and then settle with our own currencies. That is a huge leap going forward. Second one is there is over 90% of what any of the countries want to import from outside Africa can actually be sourced somewhere in Africa. There are many machineries you can get from South Africa. There are many things you can get from Egypt and Morocco and Nigeria, all the crude and gas and all of that. But we're not doing that. You're still going up and down. And then currency you don't have, you're looking to sacrifice your economy because you're looking for it. So that we need to trade within ourselves so that we can raise internal trade from 12% to up to 20%. Europe started the same time with Africa, with West Africa at 1975. Both of us were on 10% intra-regional trade. Today, they're over 70% on international trade, and we are still around 14%. Mm-hmm. You have to trade inside to make sure you do that capacity development. You also increase your value addition. Consume what you produce and then produce what you consume. Your excess you can trade on the international market.
Right.
But look for internal self-sufficiency. And that's what it has to be. You keep talking to politicians. They do other things. But that's what you're going to do to save this continent.
Right. So I want to come back very briefly, Professor Lucas, on to sanctions and if they actually work. And I want to, if you can give us a few examples of where you think that sanctions have actually achieved intended objectives. How do you determine if sanctions have succeeded or failed, especially when you look at a situation where we are now with such catastrophic repercussions and turmoil in the global economy?
It tends to be in the discussion of sanctions, it's like an all or nothing, which is they either don't work at all or they're extremely effective. And you really have to go to the details of the case. So if we had an hour to discuss the effect on Russia to limit their war effort, it's been significant. It has, for example, restricted the replacement parts that Russia can get for its military. And given the high losses in Russian armaments, especially their armored vehicles, it means they cannot replace them. It's had significant effects on Russia's advanced technology in its industry. So in terms of getting high-tech military equipment to the front lines, they're restricted. It's restricted their energy markets so that they can still supply oil and gas to other clients, especially China, but quite often at a discounted price and quite often using longer supply routes. So it has significantly hurt their revenue stream which comes in. But I think the broader question again comes to where I started off with this. And that is that trying to say that sanctions are the starting point of this is actually the wrong way to look at the effects that are taking place. The question at the end of the day is at what point will Russia stop its invasion of Ukraine? Now, sanctions can have a part to play in helping to do that, but so can actually, in fact, pressure from African leaders. So I think it's very significant that President Saleh, the Senegalese president and the chair of the African Union, said just a few days ago, after the missions to Kyiv and Moscow, it's really up to Vladimir Putin now to make some step to show that he wants peace, to make some humanitarian gesture, and then going beyond that, really that message that came out of that African delegation, which is, look, this Russian invasion cannot keep going on. It's not saying that African leaders are siding with the West.
Right.
It's not saying that they side with the sanctions, but it is saying that they are addressing the fundamental cause here, which is, when will Vladimir Putin ease the damage that he's causing all of us because of the decision he took in February 2022?
All right. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we will examine how to ensure a more balanced and equitable approach in addressing global conflicts. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's now continue with our discussion. Still with me from Pretoria, Kofi Kwako, in Abuja, Professor Ken Ife, and joining us from Birmingham, Professor Scott Lucas. Kofi, let me start off with you here and look at some statistics from the IMF, which is putting African households already spending over 50% of their overall consumption on food and energy. Are we seeing any efforts, though, by African leaders here to try and mitigate the impact of the sanctions on Russia, on their economies?
Well, Africans have done their best to do it. I mean, most Africans don't have the leveraging power of either Russia nor China. Most of these economies are not doing quite well. In fact, one of the things that happened the past 10 years, in fact, is that China's trade and China's growth was helping Africa grow by association. We haven't seen much of that from the United States or from the European nations. They've been sucking out the lifeblood and energy and everything else. And everything that they do most of the time in terms of trade is to export inflation and unemployment on Africa. We see that all over the place. If you look at the numbers of unemployment across the continent, it's very large and huge. In Francophone African countries, for example, we can see the role of France that has the CFA and using most of these economies as almost as a slave economy to really profit and then do well. So Africans are doing what they can, but they haven't been able to break that ceiling of inflation. And again, going back to what we were saying, anything, and we can even wait for the next crisis globally. It will have a negative effect on Africa because we're not ready. So inflation by itself, it's something that's not easy to deal with. I mean, the U.S., Canada, European countries, and G7 nations have been struggling themselves after the sanctions. And I have to disagree a bit with Professor Lucas that what the sanctions have created, that they've created some kind of boomerang inflation in those nations. The G7 nations are struggling with sanctions.
Right.
And anybody who will be disputing this should go and look at the numbers. And again, even with Russia, Professor Lucas, I don't know where you got those numbers, but go back to the World Bank and look at the numbers. The 3% from Russia, which was sort of discussed and debated by most G7 countries. But Russia is doing much better than people thought the sanction will do. So what Africa has to do is to figure out a cushioning way to soften most of the impact of any sanction coming from anywhere. Unfortunately, the structural dependency that we've got ourselves into and the lack of agency to be able to take decisions to help our own economies is not there. Until we sort this out, right, inflationary issues will sort of plague Africa.
Professor Lucas, your response to that, Russia hasn't really been that badly damaged.
I mean, I think we have to be clear-eyed here. And again, we have to be clear-eyed about what's happening in Africa and in the rest of the world. In terms of the specifics, no, the Russian economy has contracted. And the World Bank has acknowledged that it has contracted. And it's contracted especially in key sectors. And the other part of this is that the US and Europe, because they've made major changes in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of their energy patterns, inflation's actually coming down across the European Union. It's not coming down in the UK, but we've got specific problems here with Brexit. And inflation has come down almost every month over the past 10 months in the United States. It's down to around about 4%. But I think there's a lesson there. And that's the one which is, why have the US and Europe been able, as it were, to deal with the shock of the Russian invasion and respond to it? And that is because, as we've been talking about with Africa, they've been able to adjust in terms of infrastructure, in terms of governance, and they've had the power of their economies as well. Africa needs to be enabled to do the same thing. So I think getting to the substance of the state, what do we mean by an African free trade area?
Right.
What do we mean with ECOWAS in West Africa? How can we start to develop infrastructure, develop manufacturing, develop sustainability in Africa on a way which is coordinated and effective?
Professor Ife, we'll put that to you. How should vulnerable economies like the economies in Africa, though, respond to situations such as this in order to enhance their food security, their energy, their self-sufficiency, and also promote trade to minimize the impact of global political and economic turbulence like we've seen now?
First of all, Russian economy benefited from this conflict. Their currency improved and strengthened considerably. If you look at their currency in relation to dollar in the last year when the invasion started, it's actually gone many times more. That is, I mean, it should about anything between 20 and 50%. It's gone up. But all other currencies against the dollar went down. All others went down. I know the case of GDP. GDP is a function of not just the strength of your currency. GDP is a function of investments coming into your country, which has reduced in Russia. Is also dependent on the consumption, that is the household consumption, which may have also shrinked. It also depends on output. The output may have reduced because even when they are reducing their output on gas, and all, it's also affecting their output. So you will have a reduced output growth. But then their currency is still much stronger. Then secondly, you come to the China. From 2005, African countries began to experience growth simply because China came in. China wasn't giving anybody grants as such. He says, I'll give you a fair price for your commodity. It is that fair price that created that resurgence of African economies, and we started growing in single digits, in double digits. African economies just went. But we need to consolidate that growth and then make sure that the unfair trade practice that we have with the likes of European Union, where they are consigning us to these commodity producers and then wanting to grab 70 to 80% of our market, import market. This is not realistic. What are you leaving for Africa continental free trade?
All right, so I want to get a view from all of you, and let me start off with Professor Lucas. How do you ensure, though, that there is a more balanced and equitable solution in addressing such global conflicts?
You deal with the facts, and you deal with conflict. And that is, had it not been for a series of measures to support Ukraine, it would have been likely that that country would have been conquered within weeks last year. And it is quite likely, as we've seen from the war crimes that carried out by Russian troops, that many thousands, tens of thousands of civilians would have been killed, in addition to the millions who were displaced. And to simply say no sanctions, in the light of that, especially ignoring the fact that the sanctions have constrained the Russian economy, that the Russian currency is being propped up by the central bank and actually reflects the weakness, the inherent weakness in the economy. You wind up sacrificing Ukrainians by saying, let's just talk to Russia, when you have a Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, who persists, not because the sanctions are not working, but because he's dedicated, this is his legacy, to try to conquer Ukraine and make it part of Greater Russia. And then you approach the wider questions, not by using the sanctions on Russia as a diversion, by addressing the fundamentals regarding what needs to be done regarding in Africa within a space of global conflicts that we have faced. And you need to do that starting with the African communities and the African leaders themselves. you look at a responsible approach to governance and a stable approach to governance, rather than an approach to governance which actually tries to pick up a bit of the profits from other powers.
All right. Professor Ife, your view?
I think talk is cheap, but it is very effective. Because when you have balance of power, you have to really assess the possibility that all these shenanigans can actually make them blink their eye. You just talk. It is the talk that led to them opening up the grain supply. It's talk. It's not by fighting. So we need to do a lot more talking and a lot more dialogue to actually get people to their senses. If you just rush to sanction, they will now prove to you that that is going to be of less effect. And the penalty that we pay is what you are seeing now. All other countries, their currencies have tumbled, inflation has gone up, you have interest. And just look at a bank just went bust, a Silicon Bank, simply because they invested in long-term instruments and they had short-term deposits. Suddenly, with the increase in prices and increase in aid, people wanted money to pay, and then they couldn't find it, and then they went down. These are some of the ripple effects. So we need to talk. It is about talk. Talk to people. And then you get a better sense out of what they can do to cooperate, rather than just leave them on the line and they're being decimated. We could do better by talking to each other. I'm telling you this.
Is there room, though, Professor Ife, is there room for dialogue to ensure that the unintended consequences of sanctions on innocent regions like Africa are minimized?
There are always room. Okay, look at why is BRICS gathering momentum. Tens and hundreds of people are now applying. All countries want to join BRICS simply because there are agenda that they wanted addressed. Agenda of equality in the economic space. There are so many agendas that they want to. People want to have a much more balanced terms of trade, and you can see that people are voting with their feet. There are so many issues that are behind the scenes that people want to address, and if you continue to avoid those discussions, then you continue to have what we are having right now. So, it's inevitable. But we don't have to risk lives to be able to have these genuine talks about how you can have a much more equitable system, how you can have a more equitable financial system that, that serves everybody, and how people can get a better deal. So those discussions need to take place.
Kofi, you have the final word.
The key for me here, I would agree fully with Professor Ife. I just wanted to add that, in fact, the response to the crisis in Ukraine is what's now shifting and creating a very different world. Many may not like it, but this is what's happening. People are scrambling to find alternative world to the hegemonic world that we've seen with the G7 and the United States. And that makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable. So be it. Things are moving fast, but there is no assurance that tomorrow's world, what many are called multilateral worlds or polycentric world, will be as easy as the ones you've known. However, the risks and rewards will be up to those who can be prepared, can anticipate. This is where African leaders must upgrade their way of dealing with global sanctions and problems and crises. And I think if we do, and if they do, we'll have less problems with the kind of sanctions we've seen so far.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for being a part of this discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts. In Pretoria, Kofi M. Kwaku, Africa Affairs Analyst. In Abuja, Professor Ken Ife, Global Economist and Chief Economic Strategist at ECOWAS Commission. And joining us from Birmingham, Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of U.S. and International Politics, Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.